Welcome, everybody, to Citizen Diplomacy International. Um, my name is Paul Lashlier. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder and the director of Learning Life. We're a DC-based nonprofit that runs Citizen Diplomacy International, or CDI, and I chair these quarterly meetings. I'm going to put in the Zoom chat. A little notice for you all to introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat so that people can see who you are, and so people can also, because we're tracking attendance, for us to be able to track your attendance, and we're kind of gathering information about each of you, including your city and your state, excuse me, your city, your country, and your email. We have two interns, I think, who are with us. Asmi should be joining us. Justin, can you do me the favor of making sure that all of our interns who are not on this Zoom are actually joined? So text them if you would. That would be great. I think Asmi should be joining us, but she's our other note taker. Um, so. So by all means, do introduce yourselves. If you haven't seen it in the Zoom chat, what we're looking for is, and let me just place that again, is your name, your city, your country, your occupation. If you could also put your email. And if you don't want to share that, you can share it with Zainab. Zainab, if you want to write a message in the Zoom chat just so people know who to contact, that would be great. Um, Feel free to cut and paste your bio, as well as a web link with more information about you and your work. I'm going to tell you a little bit about, for those of you maybe unfamiliar with us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Citizen Diplomacy International, um, and place that information in the Zoom chat. Oh, I guess it's too much information. Hold on a second. So CDI, or Citizen Diplomacy International, is one of the programs of Learning Life. And as you might imagine, or know already, because of a variety of kind of factors, including globalization, the internet, rising education levels, and long-term democratization, not short-term, citizen diplomacy is growing across the world. CDI is a program and network of Learning Life, and we're devoted to developing um, uh, this advancing citizen diplomacy across the world. We do that through research and through these quarterly meetings thus far. I am going to also share with you a few links to citizen diplomacy information in case you're interested in connecting with us or getting our emails. Let me place that in the Zoom chat. So you'll see here in the Zoom chat, we have a place where you, if you're not getting our notices, to sign up, you can sign up to get notices via email of the meetings and the results of the meetings. You can also connect with us on Facebook and LinkedIn. The two links are there. And you can also connect with us on YouTube, where we place recordings of these meetings after the meetings. So all of our CDI meetings are on the internet on YouTube. And lastly, if you're interested, you can join our wider network, the Democracy and Diplomacy Community. There's a link there for more information. I've got a few other meeting details to share with you. As you see, this meeting is recorded. We will be taking screenshots. And in fact, I have to actually quickly assign some of our interns to do that. Jocelyn and Angel, could you guys please take screenshots throughout and then just send them to me? About 15 screenshots would be great, each of you. Um, and we, Given that this is citizen diplomacy, your active participation is important. So, in preparation for the discussion, I ask you to write your questions or comments during the presentations in the Zoom chat. We'll get your Zoom chat questions and comments when the presentations are completed. So each of our speakers is going to be speaking for a total of 30 minutes, so 10 minutes each. I will time them. And so let me introduce our speakers very briefly, and then Alina, Cesar, and Sherry can share whatever they wish. But Sherry Lee Mueller is going to be speaking first. She is joining us as a distinguished practitioner in residence at the School of International Service at American University. Following Sherry's comments, we'll hear from Alina Dolia, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Alina, did I get that right? Okay.
Yes.
And so Alina will is an associate professor in strategic communication and public diplomacy at, I think it's Bournemouth University. Is that right? Okay. And Cesar Jimenez Martinez is assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. So both Alina and Cesar are joining us from the United Kingdom. Before Sherry starts, I need to take a screenshot of everybody. So if you would, for those of you who don't have your cameras on, please turn them on. And in through, whoops, that's not what I was trying to do. Hold on a second. In 3 seconds, I'll ask you to smile on three. One, two, three, smile. Fantastic. Thank you all. Okay. Uh, Sherry, you are first.
Paul, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here with Alina and Cesar and colleagues. I see some of my colleagues from the Public Diplomacy Council. Ever since I was fortunate enough to co-author a book chapter with Paul for a book entitled The Research Agenda for Public Diplomacy, I've been a great fan of the work of Learning Life and particularly the pioneering work of Citizen Diplomacy International. So really glad to be with you all today. I'm going to start with the basics, definitions. When I was president of an organization called Global Ties US, we defined citizen diplomacy as the idea that the individual citizen has the right, even the responsibility, to help shape foreign relations. We said one handshake at a time. And that was on the wall of our reception area. Another favorite definition of citizen diplomacy comes from my own background. I grew up on a farm in northern Illinois with nothing international in my background until a 4-H leader participated in one of the first farmer-to-farmer exchanges with the then Soviet Union. He came back, he showed the slides to our club. I was never the same. Fast forward to my first international exchange program, which was an experiment in international living program, to Germany. And remember, I knew no one in Germany, no one in my American group. And the last thing mom said to me when my parents put me on a flight so I could catch a student ship to Europe was, Sherry, remember, don't talk to strangers. So I made a career of talking to strangers, urging other people to talk to strangers. And at its best, I believe citizen diplomacy is the art of speaking to strangers and turning them into friends. I happened to be studying at the Fletcher School at Tufts when Dean Gullion coined the term public diplomacy and declared it worthy of economic study. As many of you know, some scholars are not fond of the term public diplomacy. One of my favorite new books about US public diplomacy is by Bruce Gregory, and he called that American diplomacy's public dimension. For our purposes today, I'm defining public diplomacy as government-funded efforts to impact public opinion abroad and ultimately public policy abroad. I'm going to share 3 observations with you. The first is that effective citizen diplomacy and effective public diplomacy are both based on 3 principles. I refer to them as the 3 R's. The first one is reciprocity. The notion that it's not for exchanges, for example, it's a partnership. It's a peer-to-peer experience. It's not a donor and a recipient. Many years working at the Institute of International Education, I had occasion to go to the U.S. Information Agency. And I know Professor Cull, who's on this call, this Zoom meeting, who's written the authoritative history of that wonderful organization, remembers on the wall their mission was telling America's story. Brass plaque, right as he walked in. And what I try to help my students understand is that telling America's story is done best by good listeners. We're not doing a lot of that right now, but I do believe that wholeheartedly. The second R is relationship building. At its best, both public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy develop long-term relationships that become the web of human connections that provide the context for other negotiations, other kinds of interaction. And finally, the last R is the relentless search for common ground. And that's a phrase I heard President Clinton he described the Fulbright program as that relentless search for common ground when he accepted the Fulbright Prize back in 2005. And I love the phrase because it underscores the fact that while we're in the business of understanding and working through cultural differences, at the heart of it, what we're underscoring is common human aspirations. You might argue right now that in the US, we desperately need domestic citizen diplomacy. And one person I wanted to just mention today is some of you would be familiar with the work of David Hogue. He's a gun control activist who survived a school shooting. He's a Harvard grad. He's 25, a leader in the Democratic Party at the moment. I heard him speak recently. And remember, he's a gun control activist. And one of the things he said is, I joined a shooting club. I really needed to understand how people who disagreed with me thought. And so now I'm asking a lot of my colleagues, what is your shooting club equivalent? How are we trying to bridge the gaps that sometimes are so divisive? Second observation, sometimes public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy coincide beautifully. And I've spent a lot of my career working on the private sector side of our State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. And because flagship exchange programs in the US are administered through a public-private partnership, it's a good example of where PD and CD coincide. And Ambassador Howard Baker, back in 2004, I thought said this very well on the 50th anniversary of the International Visitor Program with Japan. He said, although the IVLP is sponsored by our government, it is actually implemented in the United States by a great network of private citizens, Americans who volunteer their time and open their homes and hearts to visitors from places like Japan. Now, given this US public-private partnership, in the US context, citizen diplomacy can give public diplomacy credibility. It can be a buffer, as in the case of the International Visitor Leadership Program, between the government and the program participant. Another important feature in the US is that citizen diplomats are active advocates for public diplomacy. Exchanges come to mind, but also for other types. The Alliance for International Exchange would be a wonderful example of this. Third observation, sometimes public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy are tremendously at odds, are diametrically opposed. I can imagine that the current leadership at our State Department was not happy with Bruce Springsteen's recent performance in Manchester. And it's interesting that historically, much citizen diplomacy in the US grew out of impatience, even disgust with government. Although ironically, it was a government leader, President Eisenhower, who captured this so well when he hosted a White House summit on citizen diplomacy in 1956. Listen carefully. This is what Eisenhower said then. If we are going to take advantage of the assumption that people want peace, then the problem is for people to get together and to leap governments, if necessary, to evade governments, to work out not one method, but thousands of methods by which we can gradually learn from each other. And he's talking about all kinds of exchanges. And out of that summit came Sister Cities International national organization, for example. And earlier this month, at the precise moment that President Trump was reprimanding the South African president, the University of Michigan Orchestra began a 5-concert tour of South Africa with a 2.5-hour program at the University of Pretoria. And it included William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony and the concert's climax. And I would urge you to look at this, occurred when 100 musicians abandoned their instruments and stood with the audience to sing the beloved Xhosa song that would be the equivalent in the US of We Shall Overcome, with gestures. And apparently it was incredibly well received. Finally, given the recent passing of Professor Joseph Nye, many have focused renewed attention on soft power. So I will close by suggesting that citizen diplomacy is a particularly valuable component of soft power and increasingly important in our turbulent world. Thanks so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic, Sherry. And you were even below the 10 minutes. It was very well timed. So Alina is next.
I will do my best to follow on the footsteps and make sure that I keep in time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a particular relationships between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy, and a particular type of citizen diplomacy, and that is the one carried out by diasporas. Before I do that, though, I just want to clarify what is a diaspora, because I found it really useful to kind of start off with by explaining, where I'm coming from. And the approach to diaspora that I'm taking is very much a sociological one. So I'm using the definition of diasporas from two sociologists, so Brubaker and Cohen, who basically talk about what is constitutive for diaspora, and that is obviously the dispersion in space, the orientation to homeland, which is really, really important, and the aspect of boundary maintenance. And Cohen even talks about 9 strands of what he calls a diasporic rope, which I find to be a very visual and powerful metaphor of what connects diasporas with homeland at the same time with the host countries. Now, in public diplomacy, when we talk about diasporas, we often refer to diasporas as being non-state actors that conduct people-to-people diplomacy or citizen diplomacy. And diasporas are often agents in their own right, are instruments of other diplomatic agendas, and are circumstantial partners on a shared interest for the states. But the angle from which I'm approaching diasporas is a bit more critical, in the sense that I'm I'm very much exploring this dimension of citizen diplomacy from a more complex perspective, because citizen diplomat in itself includes certain assumptions of loyalty towards the country of origin or towards the homeland. But diasporas can be incredibly disruptive to both homeland and hostland. And what I argue is that these disruptions comes from emotions, and that we need to actually integrate the scholarship on emotions and understand migration and displacement as an emotional process and as a traumatic process, because this is what will help us understand the complexities of diasporas, and also understand that diasporas can be at times loyal, so can be agents, can be our partners, right, from a practitioner perspective or from a government perspective, but they can also be, as Sherry was mentioning, at odds with the government, can disrupt the work of government. So I came across this idea of or these dimensions of emotions and the emotional costs of migration when I started to do field work between 2018 and 2020 in the UK amongst the Romanian diaspora in the UK. So my research is very much around the Romanian diaspora. The Romanian diaspora is the largest European diaspora at the moment. So more than a quarter up to a third of the Romanian population, which is around 19 million, is living abroad. And it is the most significant, if you want, European migration, intra-European migration phenomenon. So from east to west, from the east of Europe to the west of Europe after the fall of communism, basically, and in a context of peace. So there is no natural disaster, there is no war, there is no conflict that steams. It's about a labor migration and economic migration. So conducting focus groups with the Romanian migrants in the UK, what I came across was the fact that there is this spectrum of anxiety, a certain fear, a shame of being ridiculous, wrong, or misunderstood, a certain complex of inferiority, a language barrier, linguistic shock, and even a cultural shock, right? And this is very much embedded in this quote: the English you think you know and you discover you actually don't know. Furthermore, I talk a lot about being nobody, about starting from scratch as a migrant, irrespective of your previous social capital. And I think it's very important to draw this distinction. It's not only about, those more vulnerable groups within diaspora who would experience these emotions, these complexes of inferiority or language barriers. It's also about those who are very much enjoying strong social capital, who are experts in their fields, and yet overnight you board a plane, flee to a different country, and when you arrive, you are literally nobody. You are nobody not only socially, considering the public status you had in your home country, but you're nobody professionally, right? What if on your business card is written entrepreneur? There are millions like you here. The fact that you start from scratch to prove the things you can or are able to do is something incredibly hard, right? So I started digging more on into this, and I came across Avamik Volkan's work on displacement and the trauma of displacement. Basic Avamik Volkan is a psychoanalyst. He's worked also in diplomacy, looking at psychoanalytical what psychoanalytics can bring into diplomacy, especially in context of conflict, for instance, or post-conflict reconstruction. And what I found most useful is how he talks about that all displaced people irrespective of them being refugees or migrants or expatriates, experience this profound sense of loss, this pain, right? It's the loss of family members, of friends, loss of ancestors, burial grounds, loss of familiar language, songs, smells, food from one's environment, loss of country, loss of previous identity, and the support system, right? And I think this is very, very important because we understand that, especially when it comes to refugees and the displacement, the forced displacement, but we rarely think of the consequences of chosen migration as being equally traumatic. Even migrants who choose to leave behind their families, their burial grounds, the processes, the norms, all these sometimes religious or spiritual rituals that are a performance of their belonging to their own communities. And that is extremely painful and leads to loneliness, right? Leads sometimes to marginalization and sometimes potentially to radicalization. So these are things that we need to be very much aware of because these constitute, I have here Bruno Catalano's sculpture, which shows the invisible luggage that all displaced people carry with them, right? So it's only the luggage that connects the upper body to the lower body, right? So what is lost is invisible in a way to us, but that's the reality of migrants who have to do all this work to integrate, to adapt, or even to prepare for a return home, right? And this invisible luggage is shaping their identity construction and their belonging in both host countries, but also within their diasporic communities. So based on that, I won't go into very theoretical aspects, but I'm proposing to look at diaspora diplomacy, to the assemblages of diaspora diplomacy, as being mediated by emotions that can be enabling. So yes, I want to act as a citizen diplomat and connect my home country, my home government, organizations from my home country with the ones in the host country. But equally, they can be disruptive, right? Can lead to disengagement, can lead to contestation, and can lead to tensions. So in order to grasp this, I argue that we need to understand that centrally in diaspora diplomacy is this element of identity, an identity that is constantly in the making. It's constantly negotiating belonging and transnational ties. There is always this in-betweenness of migrants and this status of liminality. At the same time, diasporas are very much digital, so they are constructed and perform in this digital environment. And we should always make this distinction between diasporas as entities, actual groups, statistics, that are constructed through statistics, and diasporas as category of practice, meaning that diasporas are constructed in claims, projects, stances, by politicians, by NGOs, by the state and its policies, by diaspora members. And it's about the loneliness, the abandonment, and the rejection that sometimes migrants and refugees feel, both from here, so the host country, and there, the homeland, and their constant need and search for roots, right? So that's where emotions come into play, having a mediating role, an enabling role, or a disruptive role. And I also constantly highlight that emotions are also discursive. They are both individual and collective, and they become political, obviously impacting identity and belonging. So going to the wrap-up part, I think it's really important to unpack this uniformity and homogeneity of diaspora through bottom-up approaches, because oftentimes when I read public diplomacy scholarship or diaspora diplomacy scholarship, there is this tendency to refer to diaspora as these homogeneous groups, right? So we need to unpack it, to look at how engagement and disengagement with the diaspora or within diasporas are triggered by a range of individual and collective emotions. We need to be mindful of the diversity of categories and groups within diaspora that are basically conflated in the top-down approaches. Because beyond any seemingly homogeneous diaspora, there are a variety of ethnic groups, a variety of gender issues. And I mentioned here the loneliness and trauma of single men, for instance, who go and work and leave their families behind, of women, of mothers, of LGBTQ plus members, social issues of social and class, so vulnerable groups, middle class elites, and so on. And another aspect that bottom-up approaches bring is the fact that diasporas would often bring into host country cultural and social tensions from homelands, right? And bottom-up analysis are needed in order to expose all of that, in order to allow us to identify how a variety of actors are formulating stances, claims, and projects on behalf of diasporas, and understanding who is communicating and on behalf of diasporas, in which context and with what agendas is really, really essential. So
Alina,
why does it matter?
Alina, just to point you're at time.
Perfect. It matters because this is how we expand the listening in public diplomacy. If we uncover the social consequences of displacement, we might be able to develop more inclusive policies to support the integration and adaptation in the host countries, can contribute to more positive public discourses, and ultimately, this allows us to understand what constitutes the vulnerability of the displaced and of diaspora, what makes them vulnerable and susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, exploitation, human trafficking, modern slavery, and manipulation by those who promise belonging and justice for the pain that was suffered. So ultimately, if we understand the psychologies of diasporas, we can build more resilient societies. Thank you.
Great, Alina, thank you. Last is, but certainly not least, is Cesar.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much also for pronouncing my name correctly. So, which is not an easy task. So I'm very, very thankful for that. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, there it is. So it is not easy to follow the talks by Sherry and Alina because they have already presented many of the things that I'm going to speak about. Although I am based in the UK, I am originally from Latin America. I am from Chile. And in the last few years, I've been thinking a lot about the role of ordinary people or citizens in relation with some of the topics that we're talking about, like public diplomacy and related ones. But I wanted to give you a caveat. Most of my research has emerged from the field of nation branding, looking at how it's been conducted in Latin America, but it still touches upon other things, partly because the practice of nation branding in the region or continent of Latin America has very much overlap and doesn't have clear boundaries with other practices or disciplines like public diplomacy, soft power, and so on. So at the end of the day, all of them are very much mixed in Latin America. So even though I'm speaking mostly from research that emerges from nation branding, I'm going to touch hopefully some things that might be of interest to you all. Also, I am focusing mostly on the Latin American experience in this case, and there are particularly some historical issues that are particular from this region or continent, but maybe they can resonate with experiences in other places. And the third thing is that, particularly towards the end, when I talk about some challenges, I pose some questions that, spoiler alert, I do not have the answer for them. So I'm happy that they can perhaps trigger some conversation now. So the first thing is that, and I know that I'm summarizing in a very horrendous and simplify way when doing this. Generally speaking, when I've noticed that there are conversations about diplomacy and citizens, so traditional definitions of diplomacy stress that it's a state-to-state relationship. So I found this definition by Bull, but there are plenty of others, as all of you know. That is the conduct of relations between sovereign states in world politics by official agents and by peaceful means. Okay? And generally speaking, definitions of citizen diplomacy with different nuances and different emphasis, they stress that states are either not involved or only partially involved, that it can be cases of people-to-people relationships, it can be grassroots, and so on and so on. But still, many of these definitions stress that what people are doing are a tool of statecraft. So basically, it's a way in which people, citizens, again, generally speaking, there are like some different, some exceptions, like Sherry was talking, but generally speaking, also when you talk to practitioners, they just like what people are doing or how we can use that to benefit the state in one way or another. Uh, what happens here is that there are different assumptions underlying many of these relationships. So one of them is that the relationship between citizens and states is harmonious. So basically, the state represents the interests of citizens, that citizens also communicating harmoniously their viewpoints to the state. There's also the assumption, because not always, but in many cases when we're talking about citizen diplomacy, even though it can be applied to regions, cities, and other places, generally speaking, it is referred to the case of nation states. So the assumption is that citizens embody or represent some kind of like national essence or national voice that can be communicated. So there is certain homogeneity there. Okay? But also, when we're talking about diplomacy or citizen diplomacy, we're talking about there are certain groups or individuals that have been chosen, but also authorized by the state to represent the nation state. They can be diplomats, intellectuals, artists, but it's technically, in practice, it's not everybody, but there are some people who are chosen to be representative. Okay? But what this shows us is that, and here I'm like echoing Weber, Max Weber, is that the state not only has a monopoly on violence, but also the state claims to have a monopoly on the communication and representation of the nation. So basically, the state is saying like, we can tell you what the nation is about. We are the voice of the nation. We can communicate the nation. That's how generally things have worked. Um, but in the case of Latin America, this can be particularly problematic, okay? Because when we look, for instance, at the so-called wars of independence, they were very much an elitist project. In fact, there is a group of historians that they claim that they were not wars of national independence, but actually it was a civil war within the Spanish Empire. And at some point, the Spanish Empire broke, and the states that were formed had the task of form nations. So you had first like a bunch of states, and they had to create nations almost out of the blue. So that's why states in the region or continent have been very much ambivalent, because again, they had to create these nations, they had to be a top-down power, but occasionally they have been a protective force too. Okay, we're talking about a very violent and also poor region of the world. But historically, people, population, el pueblo, I'll say it in Spanish, have not been really needed by the elites. Only recently, in the last few decades, that has happened, because basically there were not that many wars with other countries, so you didn't need soldiers. There was not an industrial revolution, so you really didn't need workers. People were poor, so you didn't have the chance of tax them very much. And only in the last few decades, in the 1990s, people started to be seen as consumer. But before that, there was very much this question among elites of what do we do with the people? And in addition to that, national consciousness, most historians agree, emerged in Latin America only in the second half of the 20th century. So before that, allegiances of people were to religion, to kingship, to particular groups, and so on. But the idea of belonging to the nation is a relatively new phenomenon in Latin America. So therefore, historically, the people, el pueblo, citizens, and so on, have been seen as a problem to manage and to contain, again, in the case of Latin America. So what happens when in the late 1990s, but especially in the 2000s, Latin American governments started to, on purpose, create and communicate versions of national identity for foreigners, be it in the way of public diplomacy, nation branding, and so on, even though there were cases before they started to consistently doing at that time. One approach that they did was let's approach people as resources. Okay, so basically you had like people on the elites, usually authorities, sometimes with the help of communication, strategic communication experts, that they saw them as like we can extract from people national essence. So we can ask them, what are we as a country? And many of campaigns did that. But in addition to that, there was a very much a disciplinary approach. So it was a way to teach them the correct way to be a national. And that happened a lot in places like Colombia or Peru, in which there were tons of campaigns in which it was not only about celebrating the nation, but also telling people this is the right way to be a Colombian, this is the right way to be a Peruvian, this is the way you need to behave to be a proper national. Okay? And every now and then, they have been used to validate very specific decisions. So sometimes when there have been a particular communication campaign, a logo, and so on, there have been specific moments in which, for instance, they run like an online poll and people vote for that, and that's considered, oh, the country approve it, the people approve it, we have been engaged with the people. So it's very much like a veneer of participation rather than something deeper. And because of that, there have been strong reactions to some of these campaigns. Peru quite often is praised by practitioners in nation branding and public diplomacy. Is a good example in Latin America. But within the country, there have been expressions like this one by local artists that have pointed out how important segments of the population, which is sometimes celebrated by communication campaigns, have been left behind in practice. Okay? But in addition with that, Latin America has a very dramatic history of the state being against the nation. That happened particularly with the dictatorships that governed most of the continent in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was an example of having the authorities, many of the armies used not against external threats, but it was against so-called internal threats. And that has also happened, or in the last few decades, we have been examples of the nation against the state, especially with cases of protests in which they have been criticized the authorities. And what is significant is that in many of these protests, people claim to act on behalf of the nation and they claim to represent the nation, unlike the state. So I find protests very interesting, and I can open a discussion to what extent they are or they are not citizen diplomacy, because they definitely rely on foreign attention. And there is very much the boomerang effect that Margaret Keck and Catherine Seeking wrote about at some point. So they want to reach authorities and citizens in other countries to establish some relationships. But also, quite often, protests are claiming that the state is lying. So protests, quite often they say that we are the real nation and not what the authorities are saying. The response of the state is that these are terrorists, these are unpatriotic individuals, foreign elements, vandals, and so on and so on. But this raises a question of, well, what is the voice of the nation in this case? Is the voice of the people in the streets, or is the voice of the authorities? And this question undermines the attempts of the state to monopolize the representation and communication of the nation. And to wrap up, this it brings several challenges for citizen diplomacy, because nation states are a very much complicated entities, as Sherry and Alina said. They're shifting, they're contested, they're changing, and therefore there is not a single voice of the nation. And we're in a context in which digital media have amplified alternative accounts of the nation. In the 19th century, states could go to a world fair and present, this is the version of the nation state, but now thanks to digital media, we have different alternative voices contesting that. And therefore, this raises questions like, well, what should states do with these voices? The authoritarian answer would be, well, we need to silence them. And we have seen that in certain places. The democratic answer is we need to acknowledge and we need to validate them. But the question is, can you mobilize them? Can you use them for statecraft? Or perhaps is what Sherry was saying at the beginning, that maybe practitioners should abandon the attempt of that and maybe should just leave people on their own for a bit to build the relationships. So I will leave it there and happy to engage with the conversation now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cesar. So we are entering the discussion, and a number of you have placed some comments in the Zoom chat, but I would much appreciate it if you used your electronic hand, and you might see my electronic hand go up, so ignore it because it magically these days goes up on its own. But by all means, raise your hand digitally if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. Um, this is a time for discussion, not just asking questions. Asmi.
Hi, thank you so much to
And
all of our
in all
speakers.
cases, if you could just quickly introduce yourself, where you're coming from.
Of course, I'm Asmi. I'm an intern with Paul this summer, and I'm also studying international relations at Davidson College. So I was so excited to hear from citizen and public diplomacy today. My first question is chronological in order of speakers. Alina had a question for you about at first when you introduced the idea of dual identities in in diplomacy as one, coming from another nation and now being loyal to your new home country. I thought of it as, hold on, outside, as diplomats, like us, like diplomats, um, trying to keep our country in mind while also being cosmopolitan. But the way that I later interpreted it was um, with citizens being loyal to both like their home country and their native country. So can can you kind of explain like how does one reconcile both identities or in what ways could they conflict with each other? And I had a second question, but I'll ask at another point.
Alina.
Okay, so I think I have to start by saying that I see identities very much as like an onion rather than dual, right? So I see multi-layered identities. So I'm originally Romanian. I did research for the Romanian in the Romanian diaspora, but Romanians, have an European identity layer. And in the countries of destination, they gradually get an English layer or an Irish layer, depending where they live. So I think the more we understand the multiplicity of layers, the more we can also understand how at times these can be negotiated and there can be tensions around these different layers because yes, you might be Romanian or American or British, but at times you might disagree with the politics or the policies of your home or host country. So at that particular point, there is a lot of tension, right? Do you feel represented by, um, your home country or host country? That's why we often hear this kind of discourses. Look, I'm Romanian, but I'm not represented by my politicians, or I'm not represented by what Romania stands for on a particular issue. And obviously, we can replace this with the US, with the UK, with Latin American countries, and so on. So I think the more we understand these flux, the identity being in flux and being an ongoing negotiation, the more we can understand that policies need to start from mapping the variety of different diaspora groups, policies when it comes to diasporas, right? Let's start by mapping out the different groups and categories of people, because there are a variety of issues. These are invisible if we operate with this homogeneous idea of a diaspora, one diaspora. And I'll give just a brief example and I'll stop. For instance, in Romania, there is a large Roma community, right? As long as we only refer to the Romanian diaspora and we don't acknowledge that part of the Romanian diaspora, there is a significant group of Roma Romanians, we don't acknowledge their issues. Therefore, policies of integration might might be missed. Let's put it like this. I'll stop here.
Hmm. Um, Others who have questions, if you could raise your hands. If for those of, especially those of you who have placed questions in the Zoom chat, please use your hands digitally to put you in order on screen here. I am going to make a comment following up while you guys are thinking about your questions. Alina, what struck me kind of following up on this these diasporas as kinds of expressions of or one instantiation of the relationship between citizen diplomacy and public diplomacy. It struck me as you were talking that in some sense, diasporas could, and so members of the diasporas could represent kind of the two poles of that relationship between citizen diplomacy and public diplomacy at its best. They are kind of like you, in some sense, uniquely positioned as people who straddle two countries to bridge the any divides or to strengthen relationships between their host country and their home country. But on the other end, in kind of the most problematic expressions, I guess, of this trauma that you point to, if they feel some sense of not belonging and that they're truly kind of a foreigner in a foreign land, and they feel some sense of kinship, particularly if that host country is has a kind of empire or oppressive relationship with the home country, they can turn into terrorists, right? And so at that extreme, it seems that they become kind of the problem that drives kind of the variety of problems that exist, including kind of rise in authoritarianism and terrorist reaction. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that before we move on.
So I would say that there are within the diaspora, within any one diaspora, we will find those super engaged, super who will identify and assume a mandate to represent their country. They see themselves as citizen diplomats. They see themselves as having a mission to represent the country, right? At the same time, there will be on the other spectrum, or at the other end of the spectrum, we'll find those completely disengaged. I don't even represent myself as a Romanian. I'm denying my ties, my belonging to Romania. I don't want to have anything to do with my homeland. And in between, and this is the extreme disengagement, right? And there's lots of loneliness, there's lots of marginalization that can, come up from this. But in between, there are a variety of other positions, and it's about the context, the political, social, economic context in the home country and in the host country that would trigger different allegiances, that would trigger different emotions, and would lead to different behaviors and manifestations of loyalty, or on the contrary, of contestation. And of course, elections are one of them, political debates or around immigrations are others. Economic reforms, because it's about the resources, the less resources the states have, then there is this competition for resources and the issue of who should get them, right? Who should have access to these limited resources. So it's quite complicated, I would say, but just I would keep this general idea of a variety of positions and a variety of loyalties that can be circumstantial as well and contextual.
Right, Alina. Nick Call, who I think is joining us from California. But Nick, if you could just briefly identify yourself and go ahead and speak.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nick Cole. I'm professor of public diplomacy at the University of Southern California. And my question is not so much about the presence of a diaspora as its absence. When I was visiting Armenia, uh, they have both a ministry of diaspora and a foreign ministry, and I was invited to be part of a seminar with those two institutions meeting together. And the first question was, tell us how about the American diaspora and the diaspora of the United States. And, I had to talk about the the rather odd phenomenon of the United States having citizens living overseas, but not really not really
Oh, I think he's having
of America's diaspora.
I think you guys are perhaps experiencing the same thing, which is Nick is having some internet issues. Nick, you were just having internet issues. I think it's
Let
gone
me just
now, but
try. Is that better?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. So my question was America's diaspora. What do we learn, or what do you make of its conceptual absence? And as the sort of we do see powerful institutions, especially in Latin America, coming out of a sort of citizen diaspora experience, like the binational centers, but that it isn't particularly forward in our conceptualization of American public diplomacy. So I'd be interested to hear each of the speakers comment on the presence or absence of the American diaspora as an organizing concept. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll now mute for my response, if you see what I mean. Thanks.
Perhaps Sisat or Sherry, if you want to start.
Well, I must confess that while Nick was talking about this, I was thinking about a question that may or may not be related, which is how can we, those of us in the field of citizen diplomacy, who write about global diplomacy or all kinds of versions of citizen diplomacy, do a better job of reconciling that concept with patriotism. And so I think, Alina, I'm going to go to you and Cesar to do better about, I'm not sure I'm objective as the American in the crew here in the panel, about how to respond to Nick Cull's question. And I'd rather turn to my other more knowledgeable panelists on this particular issue.
Cesar?
Yes, yeah, that's a really interesting question, Nick. Thanks very much. So when I look at the case of Latin America, um, there are definitely, as you were saying, very strong binational groups. So, in fact, Chile is a very particular and special case. For instance, in the like Chile has the biggest Palestinian colony outside of Arab countries. And that informs a lot the foreign policy of the country and many the ways in which people within Chile view things. So if you check the news, some of the things what the Chilean government has been doing lately are very much informed by that. So that is kind of like a very dramatic example of that, of how binational groups can inform what happens within the country. But if we're talking about more specifically about the case of American diasporas, the issue is that within Latin America, the United States is seen as the big other against which historically Latin American identities are constructed. And this is from the very formation of the United States and the rest of Latin America. And it's this big other that it's both a dream and a nightmare, sometimes at the same time. So it's been very much like this place that is very much admired. So it's very much kind of like this is the future. These are like many things that we should aspire to, but at the same time, it can be a nightmare at moments, and there has been like a sometimes a problematic history with the United States and Latin America. I think that what what at some point happened, which have This is just anecdotal evidence, okay? But what I've noticed is that at some point, the United States did not have a single story with Latin America, but it had several stories, okay? And there were people who could find many things that they found appealing within the United States. But I have the impression, and this is by talking to people when I go there, is that the stories that are traveling seem to have shrink a little bit, and there seem to be less stories about that. And therefore, what's happening now is that more people that either love or hate what's happening there. So that either see it like as the dream or the nightmare, but there seems to be like less variety that is communicated for people to choose that. And that was one of the extraordinary, in my view, strengths of the United States for a long time, that very much that variety of things that if you were into literature, you can find a lot of amazing literature or cinema or politics or the economy and so on and so on. And and I'm not saying that those other stories do not exist. I'm sure that Sherry, Nick know much better that probably yeah, they're still there, but they're not traveling as much as perhaps they travel at some point. So I think that is something that has definitely changed in my view in the last years from the perspective of Latin America.
Hmm. Alina, any thoughts?
Actually, the way we responded to this is brilliant because it's exactly aligned. I mean, this is something that Cesar and I wrote about in a paper when we looked at protests, right? Protests in Latin America, protests in Romania, and what they had in common, and this constant relation with the America or with the West, and how the West sees the countries either in Latin America or in Europe or elsewhere, right? So I think the missing of diaspora is not actually missing. I think that's, I mean, I'll have to think further, Nick, to this question. So thank you so much for posing it, because it will provoke me to think further on this. But I think, you know, we had the traditional diasporas, the historic diasporas, which were displaced diasporas due to conflict and war, right? And this go back to the Jewish diaspora, Italian diaspora, Indian diasporas, and so on. And they've moved usually west, and they moved in the so-called big countries, right? The countries that those in east or further south have always been admiring and have been perceiving as safer, more developed, right? So for those countries, when it comes to the US or when it comes to the UK, the fact that there's been this institutionalized presence in the East, in the global South, and so on, has led to there a certain omnipresence. That's why it was only after 9/11 that this effort of citizen to citizen diplomacy, explaining what America is, and you know what the Britain's effort have mainly started after Brexit, if I'm honest, right? So I think it has to do with the fact that there is a history of institutionalization, of promoting America to the world, of promoting Britain to the world. So diasporas are very much doing this citizen to citizen diplomacy, and only most recently have become these tensions from within the US, from within the UK, have been felt also within diasporas. And in a way, I think the paradox we're seeing is that the American diaspora, or the British diaspora, are very new in dealing with these different tensions and conflicting feelings about, what the US is, what the UK is, and so on. That's my initial response, but I'll give it further thought. Um,
So
thank you.
one of the people who is in this meeting is Diego Bolivian, who's joining us from Bolivia, and I'm wondering if you have because Diego spent a considerable amount of time doing public diplomacy, kind of directing a Fulbright program in Bolivia. But is now retired. But I'm wondering if you have any kind of perspective perhaps on what Sisad has mentioned about the relationship between the United States and Latin America, but also this relationship between citizen diplomacy and public diplomacy.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. I think I was a little bit late, but it was a problem of not of sort of missing the fact that the your time is not my time. Anyways, yeah, I there's so much in my mind right now, and forgive me if I'm a little bit jumbled up. I retired, almost said graduated. I retired last year after 24 years of being the director of the Fulbright program in Bolivia, not just Fulbright, but many other programs. And I was obviously working for the State Department, for the US government. And I have this amount of information in my mind and experiences based on unbelievable experiences. I think Bolivia is a very special case because Bolivia is a country that in the census of 2001, 60% of the population, that has changed in recent years, but 60% of the population in 2001 said that they were of indigenous origin. So there's no doubt that Bolivia has been, it is, I would say I was reading some other things and they were talking about Peru. No, no, no. Bolivia is the most indigenous country, I think, in Latin America. I would say even above Peru or Mexico. And in a way, in a way, when we talk about diaspora, I see like an internal diaspora here in Bolivia, because Bolivia has also been a country where divisions have been just extreme, extreme. There was a revolution. I don't know how much you may know. I think the Bolivian case is very fascinating, but until 1952, this was it's almost like a pseudo feudal kind of society, of country, and it's changed after 1952. It's an incredible revolution. I think it deserves a lot more studying. But the fact is that from the U.S. Embassy and with the resources of the U.S. Embassy in the last 24 years that I was there, we had a panorama that was just unbelievable in terms of helping all these sectors of society, the underserved sectors that are the indigenous, that are the majority, but obviously have been treated as a minority. But we started to see how they have started to incorporate into society, to the point where, in 2006, they elected a president of 100% indigenous extraction, Evo Morales. And it's the sociological phenomenon. I'm not going to speak about what Evo Morales did in the government, or I think it was an incredible thing. Unfortunately, not it could have been something really amazing, but unfortunately, a lot of things happened. I think it's corruption, essentially, what happened. But my take is that from the U.S. Embassy, with all the programs that we put forward, primarily to help indigenous to become empowered to be able to participate in the political, economic, social life of the country, has been enormously, enormously successful. And that happened precisely since Evo Morales took power, because Evo Morales in 2006 became the president of Bolivia. And in 2008, he expelled the ambassador of the United States from Bolivia, essentially because of ideology. Unfortunately, ideology can really hurt and damage people. But I think that I have so much to talk about, develop, and and all the experiences that have helped this enormous segment of society to become empowered and become active participants in the life of politics and academics and you name it. And we had a year. I remember in 2012 we had out of 100% of our, it wasn't very many. It was like 7 Fulbrights, but they all came from the city of El Alto, and they were all 100% of an Aymara extraction, indigenous.
Hmm.
And my Lord, even today we have two that are still doing postgraduate work in the US. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just unbelievable.
Hmm.
So there's so much to develop and talk about that. I think the Bolivian phenomenon is really worth investigating more. And I think it's my challenge too, to really try to interpret and analyze what happened to Bolivia and the impact it has
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
has created.
Thanks, Diego. I think this gets to some of the questions in the Zoom chat, and perhaps we can kind of focus on this in the time we have remaining. And this is perhaps, I mean, it's something that all three of you can chime in on, which is how do we go about properly representing kind of these varied voices, right? Cesar, you're among other things you pointed out. And Alina, you likewise pointed out that both in diasporas and in other kind of forms of citizen diplomacy, there's just tremendous variety. There's tremendous diversity of kind of constituencies, interests, et cetera, and so forth. And one of the questions that Giles Scott Smith posed in the Zoom chat, which I'm scrolling to try to find again, but the essence of what he was trying to ask is, what role or what kind of citizen diplomacy would better represent and in conjunction with official diplomacy would better represent that kind of diversity. I'm trying to get to Giles' comment on this, but it's not appearing right away because thank God we have a variety of comments in the Zoom chat, which are much appreciated. But yeah, if you could speak to this issue of or here I have it here. Um, this is what Giles indicated. He assumes that the purpose of the citizen diplomacy, CESAR, that you're referring to is to build transnational alliances of support that can be used to pressure the state to recognize identities, rights domestically, and that citizen diplomacy is aimed at changing the practices of the state. I mention this in part because one of our previous speakers was a political theorist from Italy who argues for transnational kind of a cosmopolitan democracy where interests that are not quite represented within countries or within a particular state are actually given some political representation at the transnational levels, whether it's the European Union or it's the Organization of American States, et cetera, and so forth. And so I'm wondering if you have some sense of, what would a better citizen diplomacy in relationship with official diplomacy represent that heterogeneity in a way that kind of, in some sense, reduces the sense of trauma, and it enhances the sense of belonging and voice. Hard question, but I'm wondering if you have any kind of sense of if there are any existing possibilities or things that could be implemented.
Is this a
Okay.
question for me or for all
All,
several of us?
it's actually for all three of you, but and anybody else who wants to chime in, but the three of you first.
So I've just put in the chat that there was earlier this year a call for evidence from the International Development Committee of the UK Parliament, seeking, written evidence from experts, scholars, practitioners in the field, and so on what can be done. And the perspective that I've brought through my written evidence was exactly the one that I've presented. And that is where I had more specific recommendations about what can be done. So I've put the link in the chat. So from my perspective, there needs to be more specific program, so more cultural mediation, right? So oftentimes, I'll speak about the Romanian case, right? So oftentimes there is the embassy, there is the consulate, but there is not, there isn't a strong diaspora infrastructure in the UK, Romanian diaspora infrastructure in the UK or in other European countries, or in other, in the US or Canada and so on. And that is largely to do with the fact that we are talking about a new diaspora. So the large wave of immigration was mainly after the fall of communism, which happened in 1989. There was a wave of migration at the beginning of the 20th century, but it was small in scale. It was to the promised land, so it was to the US, but it's small in size. So the lack of infrastructure obviously brings the first point, capacity building. Capacity building, so organizations, so both the Romanian state, but also the British state should support the capacity building of diaspora organizations through the different programs or funding programs that they have. We need mapping for, and not only of the Romanian diaspora, about mapping of the variety of different communities and diasporic communities that exist across the country, together with the different organizations of different diasporas, right? Because this will lead to more listening, what Sherry was talking about. So I think we need to reconceptualize the listening element in public diplomacy by including diasporic groups as not only, domestic groups, but understanding that they are actually transnational groups. So they operate here domestically in the host country, but they are also with a foot in their homelands, right? So their transnational existence is something that needs to be acknowledged as well. From this, obviously, emerge this amazing capacity to act as bridge builders and citizen ambassadors and so on. But at the same time, from this stems also potential tensions, right? I think I'll stop here.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that others can also reply.
Cesar or Sherry?
Yes,
I was just
I can
going,
take it. Yeah.
oh, go ahead,
Sherry.
Cesar.
No, Sherry, you go first.
Okay, I was just going to say, Paul, maybe you could just say how large the CDI bibliography listing is, because part of the fundamental problem, and I've just enjoyed hearing all of you today, we don't know what else is out there. There's a lot going on already. And I just am so glad that CDI is trying to be a hub for this, because the challenge is there are probably some others that are doing certain things that we're talking about, like citizen diplomacy training. But do we know it? Where is it? So I don't know if you want to just add, Paul, that, and then
Yeah.
Cesar.
Yeah, just quickly, CDI does research on the literature out there on citizen diplomacy and related literature on public diplomacy. We also track writers and individual kind of leaders and organizations doing citizen diplomacy, but we're actually not doing the kind of mapping that Alina is pointing to, which I think is a different area of research, which is quite valid. I think in your case, Alina, you're arguing for mapping diasporas, and there may be some academic out there that is doing that kind of mapping, at least of some diasporas, and that would, I think, help in the to validate the second point that you're making, Alina, about trying to institutionalize and fund the representation of diasporas formally in diplomacy, which I think, in some sense could be great. But Sisad, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts.
Yes, thank you. So I think that one of the main challenges that anyone working on citizen diplomacy or on diplomacy in general has is that social life is messy. Okay, so social life is people disagree. So states of harmony, agreement are very, very rare in society. If in, and I'm not sure if they happen at all. Okay, so especially if for those of us who live in a relatively democratic society, disagreement is part of that. And because of that, I think that any attempt of controlling, which sometimes I feel that the literature tries to tell people how to control things, how we can control to some extent diaspora so they can speak and do something that benefits the state, or how we can control these sort of people that they benefit the nation and so on and so on. It's very likely it's going to end up in failure. So I think that the role of diplomats is not controlling, but facilitating spaces and just creating the space and be open that you're not going to control the outcome. And maybe things are going to, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, there are governments that are controlling the state and they like some outcomes, but they don't like some others. And that's part of the work is trying to resist that. And I think that also as we as citizens have, especially those who live in democracy, we have the obligation and we need to do our best within our means to try that the state does not identify internal enemies, because that's something else and that affecting all these discussions that we have when we're talking about what happens with minorities, what happens with LGBTQ, with particular groups, and so on and so on. Things can become very dramatic when those in power and different places say, like, these are the people who are not patriotic, who are not the nation, who are not part of us, and they should be shut up or sometimes worse. And I think that is our responsibility, especially all of us are in positions of power, even if we don't feel it. Okay, all of us, even if it's a tiny, tiny bit of power, all of us have that, and we need to do our best so that doesn't happen. And again, accept the messiness of social life and see ourselves as people that facilitate spaces, no matter how humble they are. I think that quite often when we talk about stories of success, it's amazing how they emerge from tiny, tiny things. Someone who met someone, a Peace Corps in a particular place and had a great experience, and that changed totally the perception of someone. Equally, how someone have a very bad exchange with someone that can also affect your vision of a particular place for the rest of your life. So I see that very much as a role, but also acknowledging that the silver bullet does not exist. And part of the difficult everyday task of someone in citizen diplomacy is trying to manage these different variables that I've been mentioning.
Mm, mm. Sisad, we'll have to end with your kind of, call for some recognition of the messiness of social life and the difficulty, I think, in kind of threading the needle and these with so much diversity in citizen diplomacy and the tensions between citizen diplomacy and public diplomacy. I want to thank our three presenters for, I think, what was a pretty rich conversation. On this topic of the relationship between citizen diplomacy and public diplomacy. I know that you've thought of it in from quite different perspectives, and so hearing your quite different perspectives is really quite valuable. We are in the last few minutes just going to allow you to share any, if you have recent publications, if you have announcements of events related to citizen diplomacy, by all means, speak them now. And then we're going to finish with Maria. Germano, who is my colleague, she helps to put together the Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin, which comes out with each of our meetings, and she will present that at the end of our meeting. So, and she'll just need a couple minutes for that. But any announcements publications, recent publications or else. Liz, you mentioned a few things in the Zoom chat, but if you have something that you want to highlight in particular, and there are others among you who have either publications or events coming up that you want to share with us, raise your hand if you would.
Paul, could I
Sherry.
just ask anyone in the audience, and Paul, feel free to share my email. Um, if you know of a citizen diplomat in your country or community that you really admire, I am going to be interviewing, I hope, a very diverse set of citizen diplomats. So I would welcome your suggestions as to someone that you think is effective, and please let me know good people to interview. Thank you so much.
Great. I just put Sherry's your American University address
Perfect.
in the Zoom chat.
Yeah, it's good.
Liz.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Really, it's just been a marvelous discussion, presentations. I wanted to say that I speak a lot widely all over the world about citizen diplomacy and traditional diplomacy and public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, all kinds of aspects. And what sort of shocks me, um, and it's something we have to deal with, is a number of traditional diplomats, as many of us know, do not like the idea of citizen diplomacy.
Yeah.
And frankly, and I've been in discussions with university, I mean, global Zoom discussions in which they simply say, you're not talking about diplomacy. That is not diplomacy. And I think, though, that it's a recognition now that there is citizen diplomacy. And one point I was thinking about in this wonderful discussion about diaspora, um, my ancestors and many of yours might have come into the United States several hundred years ago, 300 or 400 years ago, and they came from places like Scotland and France and Wales and England. And what's interesting, it occurred to me that people, when you know where your ancestors came from, you're still following a kind of diaspora diplomacy when you are insisting that your sister cities group in your city, have a connection to Scotland or have a so, and the other point being is that I think that digital diplomacy, with all its, breadth, has really increased the possibility for perpetuating uh, diaspora diplomacy in ways that got lost before. We could, people could write letters and then that was the end of it. Anyway, thank you all so much.
Yeah, Liz, good points. This is an example of digital diplomacy. It's facilitating all kinds of citizen diplomacy and diaspora diplomacy across the world. Okay, we have just a couple minutes, and I want to share. So Maria is going to, who's joining us on screen, is going to let you know about the most recent CD bulletin, which we will be sending out via email and via social media. And so let me share my screen and I will share and she will speak the Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin. Hold on a second. Maria, go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you again for really an interesting conversation today. Just wanted to note that there is a young diplomats forum taking place in Washington, D.C. in July. Please note the deadline for applying is June 15th. There's a separate forum taking place in Brussels in September, so there are links for both of those activities. On the second page, I would just highlight that a couple of these opportunities are online. So for those of you who can't travel, Diplo has a series of online courses, including on public diplomacy, but in other areas of diplomacy. So a link to that. Chatham House is having a really interesting conversation later this month on sort of the challenges of global governance. Again, it's both in person and online. I would want to put a plug so that you don't miss that Learning Life's Family Diplomacy Initiative has got some online experiences available both in the category of family diplomats and family diplomacy ambassadors. please take a chance to take a look at those links there for further information. The follow-on page is a series of articles and books, a lot of them highlighting citizen diplomacy, public diplomacy. I think those are all going to be hopefully some interesting reads for you. And then please do make sure you take an opportunity to read the profiles of all of our speakers today. Really some very thoughtful answers to the questions that we posed. So thank you all.
Fantastic. And so, yes, we have profiles of each of our speakers so you can learn more about them. You'll receive that via email and via LinkedIn and I think Facebook as well. Just a reminder that our next meeting is hold on a second, it is on Wednesday, September 3rd, from 12 to 1:30 p.m. New York, Washington, D.C. time. It is on authoritarianism and citizen diplomacy. And the last meeting of the year is on December 2nd, and it's on environmental diplomacy. So thank everybody for your participation. Thanks again to Sherry, to Alina, and to Cesar for their rich contributions to this discussion. All right, everybody, have a good rest of your week. Bye.